thank you to Lakshmi for that introduction, and to Rohan for his comments as well, and for Saifang for acting as director of the whole enterprise. So basically what I'd like to talk about a little bit here is set some context in terms of the investor's perspective on this particular issue. And to do that, I'd probably like to go back and talk a little bit about ethical investing, impact investing, how sustainable investing, however you wish to describe it. And then we can perhaps focus in more on the investor's view of this particular issue in terms of home workers. So just by way of agenda, I'm just going to talk briefly on one slide about the firm, and then I'm going to focus more on responsible investment, and then we're going to focus on the idea of supporting and investing in home workers and the sort of response of investors to the current situation. So in terms of about Castlefield, we were established in 2002. We're based in Manchester. We do three things. We might do investment management, we do financial advice, and we do what is described as fund administration, which is really the kind of technical operation of investment funds. We have funds under management of about £400 million. We're an employee-owned business, so we're very quite focused on employee rights and employee representation. We're about 60 staff. We're very much values-driven and focused on what we describe as thoughtful investing, which I'll come back to later on. So we have this specialism in ESG and sustainable investing, and so that's the firm. You can tell by the grey hair, I've been around quite a while, got 25 years industry experience, including 8 years at Castlefield. And actually, I'm an alumnus of the Alliance Manchester Business School from a long time ago. So if we could just move on to ESG and responsibility. Thank you. We take as our base definition of responsible investment the one used by the UN as part of its wording in the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment. So ESG we view as a strategy and practice to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors in investment decisions and in active ownership. So it's important to pick up this point about it's both the strategy and the practice. So it's within our thoughts, and also we want to put our positive thoughts around this area into practice and for measurable results, really. The idea of responsible investment actually goes back to the 19th century and the Methodist Church in North America. So responsible investment is, why would you invest responsibly? The Investment Association, which is a UK body of investment managers, has 3 reasons: to maximise long-term returns, yes, to achieve particular sustainable outcomes, and to reflect a particular set of values and beliefs. So when you look at it in that way, the better question is, why wouldn't you invest responsibly? So I just want to pick up on some of the main ideas on this, the themes of ESG that you may have heard about: environmental, social, and governance issues. Often different investment opportunities have different primary remits. So for example, on the left-hand side, if you're looking at an environmental investment, you may be thinking about wind or solar energy. Such an investment may have less of an overt social focus. But equally, it could be vice versa. You could have a more socially focused investment that does less impact in terms of environment. But even in an environmental investment, there are social factors to consider, such as employees. The governance factors on the right there arguably glue everything together, as they're the sort of checks and balances on executive management. And they're the ones who are setting the strategy on the E and the S. So if we move on to the next slide, this is presented as a flow chart, but really it's almost like a cycle that can run on a loop in terms of the way we look at individual investments. So the working consideration before an investment is made. We look at the strengths and weaknesses of the investment case, and the financial requirements before we make our decision. Once we are invested, we get involved in voting at annual general meetings. We engage on ESG issues with the directors of the company, and we describe this as sort of active ownership, in that we're not a passive fund, we're not a passive investor who just owns the shares and doesn't vote or doesn't make a contribution as a co-owner of the business. We like to engage actively with management. In terms of exit, that's the sort of sell discipline and what. So from an ESG perspective, what might drive you to sell a share if there's some kind of failure, governance failure, that we may see in the textile sector, for example, or in electronics, in terms of some of the issues that we're highlighting today. So just to move on to the next slide, the types of responsible investment that we talk about feature, there's sort of four areas really. One is negative screening, which really is where you exclude obvious areas such as, let's say, oil and gas, for example, in our case, or strategic armaments and those sort of areas. You may also look at positive screening, where you think about what are the best-in-class investments within your universe. And then there's this concept of impact investing, which I'll touch on briefly. And then bringing it all together is this idea of ESG integration, so it's all integrated into the entire process. So just on the next slide, this is a standard set of sectors where you probably have no exclusions in this approach to investment, in that it's a typical range of investment areas that you may wish to look at, with no particular screening in place. So you can see fossil fuel producer and mining are on there, and areas such as consumer goods, which is where we're talking today. If you could move on, please, to the next slide. So the most obvious red boxes are the ones that we at Castlefield would exclude. Quickly, there are other areas where we might have adopted a similar approach, perhaps on alcohol, for example. But what's important also here is we talk about a materiality threshold, whereby we may invest in a company that is active in some of these areas, but only up to, let's say, 10% of their revenue or profitability. For example, you might look at a food retailer such as Tesco or Sainsbury's, and they obviously sell tobacco and alcohol, but it probably equates to less than 10% of what they sell. And so we would regard that as still a viable investment, although we wouldn't invest in Diageo or a tobacco company, for example. So if we just on positive, I think we just go on too far there, Sir Hoy. Just on positive screening, the areas in green are the ones where we may wish to focus our efforts. And whilst there being, for other investors, nothing wrong with the other areas, we would look to positively support these particulars. We also do have exposure in things like consumer goods, property, etc. So sort of the blended screening really on this is where this will give you an idea of the way a responsible investor would look at certain areas. So they would actively promote the green areas, they would actively not invest in the red areas, and the sort of amber areas are ones where we may start to exercise our judgment in different aspects of those particular companies. So just moving on to some of the positive sustainability themes are those areas that we do seek to favour. We've recently sort of updated our approach to this positive themes, and we've added the 4 new themes on the bottom there, the ones that are in sort of a sand sandy colour, including sustainable supply chains. So we're currently working on categorising all our holdings according to one of these headings. We may not be able to, maybe some square pegs in round holes, as it were, but generally we're going to try and do that as well as we can. So the areas that we look at are in sustainable supply chains. Cyber and digital security is a very strong investment area for us. Regulatory compliance is another one that is really coming to the fore at the moment. So I just wanted to move on to very briefly, this is not an area we invest in particularly ourselves, but it's just something to kind of complete the picture on ESG investing. And this is what's regarded as impact investing. So if you look over at the left-hand side of this spectrum, where we're looking at grant support and subordinated loans, etc. So that may be where you invest in a company with the aim of getting probably a non-financial return as well as hopefully a financial return, but you would prefer to foreground and support the non-financial return. So the further left you go on this spectrum, the nearer you are to philanthropy, for example. So having sort of set the context of the ESG investing, I just wanted to move on to supply chains and the vulnerable workers that we're talking about today. So the regulatory framework for investors in the UK certainly is the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 requires UK PLCs oversight to issue an annual statement every year on modern slavery and related practices, which covers these at the other areas of supply chains. You also have the UN PRI, which I mentioned previously, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And Goal 8 relates to good work. We are very much governed as ESG investors by those Sustainable Development Goals. I've also noted the comment by the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC, which I know the business school works closely with. There are two pieces of work that they've done recently, one of which is on the governance code, which is how companies manage themselves, and the 2021 stewardship code, which we've submitted our entry for our response to, which governs investor behaviour. So in corporate governance, this is the system of rules and practices and processes by which a company is directed and controlled. This is where we're looking for a well-run company. So well-run companies tend to make good decisions and tend to be produce better returns for investors. So business is all about the quality of the decision-making processes and the taking into mind the interests of all stakeholders. This includes shareholders and employees and suppliers and the community. So all that falls under the remit of the Corporate Governance Code 2018. So on to stewardship. This is the set of rules that really govern how we as investors manage ourselves in meeting our clients' requirements and also our regulatory requirements. So they basically set out the principles of effective stewardship. All signatories must report annually. We recently submitted our most recent report on how they meet the code's guidelines, and the actual code has been stiffened up recently, and so we're now working towards seeing how we match the new tighter guidelines on stewardship. So the activities that we might get involved in are voting at, well, we always do get involved in, I apologise. We're voting at company meetings, and we always engage with the companies that we invest in. With regard to research sources for investors looking at home working, these are the sort of areas that we might look at, the websites we might look at. So the Clean Clothes Campaign, which has produced some good reports on this area, corpwatch.org, and the other one is Labour Behind the Label. So if there's some useful reference points for you there in terms of the way that this is the kind of research and work that we as investors look at when we're considering an investment. So why do companies use home workers from our perspective? So what are the factors and pushing brands and suppliers to using them? Well, it's the low cost. There's no need to pay for factories, health and safety, care of workers, etc. Low wages, workers have few, if any, rights, and often no representation or collective voice. Happily, as we will discover today, there are people working to address that issue. Home workers as a workforce are flexible. We can turn production on or off, and we can switch products easily. It reduces risk when managing a workforce becomes someone else's problem. It's out of sight, out of mind, and therefore all this helps increase profitability. To Western Europeanize, some of these are 19th century working practices, but as we know, they still go on in many parts of the world, and as we found out recently, things like this still happen in the UK. But I think it's important to note that, sorry, I've gone too far. If you could go back, it's important to note that there are some attractions for home workers, which again, I think we probably will touch on later today. Home working suits many workers, especially married females. Even if the wages are low, it gives them flexibility to manage perhaps family care as well as work. Working from home avoids the travelling to a factory setting, which may be unsafe or maybe difficult journey. People working on a piece rate can often choose which hours they want to work and which hours they would rather not work. They're an integral part of the supply chain. So the idea should never be to eliminate home working or paint it as a completely negative aspect in the supply chain. But really, we're keen to recognise home working as an integral part and push for improving working conditions. Just my last slide on this is just really, so having established those as what is the approach of the responsible investor, we need to focus on areas such as supply chain due diligence. We need to focus on implementing at the local level the UN SDG number 8 on decent work. We need to look hard at company modern slavery statements and other kind of corporate disclosure. Avoid the potentially contentious industries that I mentioned earlier. If we are invested in these companies, then engage with them on these practices. And if problems persist after sort of a concerted campaign of engagement, we divest, i.e. we sell the shares. So that's really my section. I just point you to those two, the two documents noted in red underneath, or the two ideas noted in red underneath with regard to do no harm and brand supporting home workers. So thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I don't know whether we're handling those now, Sehwang, or in the
thank you.
later
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are really kind of taking up, running out of the timetable. We are running short of time. So can we have the